Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our live stream event today titled Have We Reached Peak TCFD to kick off day one of London Climate Action Week. My name is Marty McBrien, and I'm the Managing Director at CDSB, and I'll be moderating today's event. We will be taking questions throughout the session, so please tweet at CDSB Global using the hashtag TCFD Action, hashtag LCAW 2020, so the London Climate Action Week 2020 hashtag, or you can email us at the Secretariat on info@cdsb.net, and we'll do our best to address them. So to set the context for today's event, in February this year, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures reached 1,027 supporters with over 12 trillion in market cap backing it. Governments across the world are currently figuring out how to make TCFD mainstream business as usual practice, using everything from TCFD reporting linked to bailout in Canada, inclusions in the currently revised non-financial reporting directive in Europe, inclusions in the Companies Act here in the UK, to New Zealand, where we're seeing or expect to see mandatory TCFD reporting later this year. We've also seen the Australian Accounting and Audit Standards Board lead the way in developing interpretive guidance on climate risk reporting. And the Japanese have changed their investor regulation to allow for more inclusion of that narrative information. So there's an awful lot going on across the world. Inspired by the TCFD and the rationale that climate doesn't sit in isolation alone, there is growing momentum towards a TCFD-like coalition for reporting natural capital and biodiversity, as called for in the UK's Green Finance Strategy last year, which includes support from the UK, French and Dutch governments and the OECD. That's really starting to gain momentum. We're also starting to see companies beginning to report and being expected to report on social impacts related to the current COVID pandemic. And with momentum shifting beyond climate, I mean, we have to ask the question, have we reached peak TCFD? Or is it just me and my own little bubble? And, and I feel like it's all there and we're at the top of the mountain. So CDSB for the last few years have run very successful TCFD implementation events in the New York Climate Week. So I'm delighted today that we've brought it a bit closer to home as I'm joined by Doug Johnston, a partner at EY in the UK, who's going to give us a snapshot of how companies are reporting against the TCFD recommendations globally in 2019 from the findings from the Disclosure Barometer. And then we're going to move on to a super panel to actually have a bit of a chat around have we reached peak TCFD? So kicking off quickly, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, or CDSB as we refer to it, have been thinking about how to integrate climate risk and opportunity into annual reports and accounts with the same rigor as financial information since 2007. For those not familiar with our work, CDSB was set up in Davos at the World Economic Forum in the absence of a globally accepted accounting framework for climate-related financial disclosures by a visionary group of businesses and environmental NGOs that saw the link between climate and financial performance. CDP provides the Global Secretariat on behalf of the board, and I'm delighted that we have one of our board members, Rodney Irwin from WBCSD, on the panel with us today. We are lucky enough to be supported by a technical working group comprised of hugely talented accountants, national and global accounting bodies, companies, investors, academics, and many others globally to help us drive the thought leadership in this space. And we achieve our mission by offering a framework for reporting environmental and climate information in the mainstream report, which is on the screen now. The framework is comprised of 7 guiding principles, so the how to report, and the 12 reporting requirements, the what to report. It is fully aligned with the TCFD recommendations and principles, as the TCFD was based on the CDSB framework and other leading reporting frameworks as well. It is complementary to existing reporting provisions, so those you may know from GRI, SASB, CDP, and existing regulation, and as referenced here in the UK for compliance with climate reporting in the Companies Act, as well as stock exchange guidance globally. In our spare time, we also power the TCFD Knowledge Hub on behalf of the TCFD Secretariat, which, if you haven't seen it yet, it's a wealth of resources designed to support issuers to report on climate-related information in line with the recommendations. So there's databases of research there, insights, guidance. There is also freely available CPD-accredited e-learning modules. They're continually being updated and new ones added. In the next few weeks, we'll be adding risk and governance. So if you haven't had a look, do have a look. It's a great place to start. We also develop resources to help companies answer the questions, and the most common ones I get personally, but I know my team would say the same, is how do I do TCFD and what does it look like? And then have I done it? And so we develop tools and resources along the way to help with that as well. And as we're sitting here thinking about peak TCFD, I've just plotted out a quick timeline to see how fast or slow the evolution of the recommendations have developed and been adopted. Now, I think if we align this timeline with, say, financial reporting standards, this is quite a quick timeline in comparison. But we've seen the TCFD and their recommendations now just reach 5 years old. And it's still backed with the authority of the G20 Financial Stability Board and chaired by Michael Bloomberg to this date. So in the UK, TCFD, we saw yesterday the launch of the Green Finance Education Charter. Well done, Andrew, who's on the webinar today from ICAW for signing up to that. We've had the release of the FCA and PRA climate risk disclosure guidance this week. We've got a current consultation out from the FCA on listing requirements. There is a lot going on. Companies have had nearly 3 reporting cycles to start to implement the recommendations on a voluntary basis. So far here and in the UK, that's quite important because we have the knowledge that they could well be mandatory by 2022 for large listed companies. So for those that haven't started the TCFD in the UK and more widely the regulation mandatory writing, I think I'm safe to say is on the wall, and I would be definitely getting started. But that's enough from me. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Doug Johnston, who is the UK leader of climate change and sustainability services at EY here in the UK. He has over 25 years experience in advising businesses on climate and sustainability strategies, policies, controls and management. He will set the scene and give us a snapshot of how we're doing globally responding to reporting against the TCFD regs and give us a few actions to think about moving forward. So over to you, Doug. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Can I get a thumbs up from Mike that I'm being heard okay? Right. Good morning, everybody. And Mardi, thank you so much for the introduction and for inviting me to be part of this event. So I've got between sort of 10 and 15 minutes to cover a few things with you. Could we just go to the overview, please, Mike? The next one, thank you. So what I want to do is I want to set the scene for the TCFD. I appreciate for many people you'll be very familiar with it, but I think it's always good to remember why is the TCFD important, and therefore why is it important for organizations to embrace it. I want to share with you some of the findings from a survey that we've done over the last year or so, reviewing the disclosures of over 900 companies and how they are complying with the TCFD. And I think just in headline answer to the question is, have we reached peak TCFD reporting? I think the answer is very firmly no. I want to highlight sort of what that research tells us about the extent to which TCFD is being adopted and used as a framework for reporting. I want to share with you some next steps and then sort of finally share some additional resources that are available to you if you want to find out more. So hopefully that's a useful way to spend the next 10 minutes. Can I go to the next slide, please? The next slide after that. Thank you very much. Okay, so why is the TCFD important? It's important because there is a growing recognition that the financial stability of economies have the potential to be significantly affected by climate risk. And as a result of that, the Financial Stability Board back in 2015 committed to look to disclosure frameworks that might support the more structured communication of how climate risks are affecting the financial performance of businesses and disclosing that externally to the market. So, I mean, you'll see here that the effects of climate risk are significant and varied across different sectors. But I also think that the significance of TCFD has grown as a result of, one, the physical risks associated with climate change and the fact that we're actually seeing a lot of those physical risks manifest themselves in recent years. But also we're actually seeing significant shocks in businesses as markets start to take on board climate considerations in purchasing decisions. For example, we're seeing significant disruption at the moment in the energy sector. So it's starting to get a grip, it's starting to become real, and I think as a result, adoption is starting to pick up. Can we move to the next slide, please? So you'll be familiar that the sort of driving force behind this was the Financial Stability Board, but Mark Carney has been highlighted very much as the sort of godfather of the TCFD in the nicest sort of way. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So I'm going to move on to the climate risk work that we do, and in particular the survey that we do each year of the climate-related disclosures of the world's largest companies. Can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so just a little bit of background to the research in terms of the coverage. So we looked at in detail the disclosures of 950 plus companies. Now that didn't just include the annual reports, we also covered sustainability reports, disclosures to CDP, and other publicly available information on the climate plans and strategies and risk exposure of different companies. We looked at 11 exposed sectors. So we looked at the 11 most exposed sectors, and we looked at 30 markets. So you can see the sort of breakdown here. So 970 companies in total. And what we've done is we've sort of split at a very high level those between sort of financial services organizations and non-financial, which includes sort of large corporates in a variety of sectors. So you can see that we've looked at the reports of a significant number of both of those key buckets. If we can move to the next slide, please. Now, our findings are split into two categories. So we have quality and coverage categories. So in terms of coverage, what do I mean by that? This is coverage of the recommendations made within the TCFD. And the quality score covers the extent to which they have met the full intent of those recommendations. And I think high level, it's worthwhile noting that that actually coverage is on the increase, but coverage is still poor. So there are significant areas of the recommendations that are still inadequately covered by most major reporting companies across the world. And even though they may be touching on some of those recommendations, the quality of the response to those is still nowhere near where it needs to be to fully meet the intention of those recommendations. Now, there's clearly variability across the different areas of the TCFD. So, for example, the scores in relation to targets and metrics and the scores in relation to governance are definitely a lot stronger than those relating to strategy and risk management. So the key reasons why these two areas are probably most weak, if I take sort of strategy, there are very few organizations that are explaining really well how climate under different scenarios might affect the ability of an organization to deliver its core business strategy. So right at the heart of this is the inadequate use of scenarios and also the base on which those scenarios are used to assess strategy. So, for example, most organizations will have a key component of the strategy, which might be expansion into new markets. So there are very few organizations that are highlighting the extent to which, for example, climate risk considerations based on different scenarios might limit or otherwise that strategic ambition. So there's that really important link between how does climate risk affect the strategy of the organization that is missing from most reports. And then on the risk management side, clearly there's the link to scenario analysis. But the main reason here is that actually you pick up a TCFD disclosure and it is virtually impossible to determine the financial risk exposure as a result of that. So a lot of organizations, for example, on a qualitative perspective, will talk about potential disruption to supply chain from different climate-related scenarios. But what does that mean financially? What does that mean for the redesign of that supply chain? What does that mean in terms of the inability to potentially meet customer requirements? So it's that financial risk that just isn't coming through enough in these disclosures. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Excellent. So the next slide covers some of the results relating to the different sectors, and I think for those of you that are immersed in this area, I think it's no surprise that actually the adoption of TCFD is much stronger in certain sectors than others. So, a key example here is that, the energy sector, as you can see here, is probably one of the strongest in terms of the adoption of the TCFD, as is the transport sector. So these tend to be sectors that are most exposed to transition risk using the TCFD nomenclature. So these are the sectors that, one, have significant emissions and therefore will be heavily affected by the pricing of carbon or future climate-related regulation, but also they're heavily exposed to market risk. So their product and the way in which they engage with their customers is significantly going to be affected by attitudes towards climate change and future regulation. And then on the other side of it, there are some sectors that you would expect probably to be stronger in this, but haven't quite embraced it yet. So if you look down the bottom at agriculture, food, forest products. So these are sectors that are heavily affected by the physical risks associated with climate change. But to date, there's very limited adoption of TCFD in any meaningful way. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Very good. So overall results by country. So we slice and dice these results in many different ways. Just a few key themes. Sort of European countries, adoption is much stronger. So if you look at the UK, you've got 90+% in terms of coverage of the recommendations. Now, the big surprise for me when I was looking at this data is the very strong coverage of TCFD in reporting in the US. And part of this, I think, is as a result of the very significant engagement by major US investors such as BlackRock on the climate agenda, who've been really pushing this with the organizations over which they have influence, but also the position that the SEC has been taking in relation to climate risk, being recognized as a material risk for many companies in many sectors. So the big surprise for me was the US, but what I would encourage you to do if you're very interested is get the climate risk barometer and really dig into the data and just see what inference you draw from it. But definitely geographically, the coverage of TCFD is patchy. So again, on a geographical scale, on a sector scale, we have not seen peak TCFD yet. So let's move on, and we're coming into land now. I'm conscious that my time is starting to run short. So let's just talk about some of the key trends. Now, I've touched on many of these as I've been going through, and I'm only going to pick up on a few of these. So I think the important bit here is that investors, I think what we're seeing through our research is investors are engaging significantly on this topic. And a really important part of that engagement has been around TCFD and the topics covered in TCFD. So, I mean, that's been a major driving force behind it. CA100 is a notable investor initiative, which is starting to get significant traction in driving both better disclosure, but also in terms of driving better performance around climate change. And then I think another key point that I probably haven't highlighted here is the piece around the financial impact of climate risks. Now, this is probably the area that is missing most from disclosure. You can still pick up a TCFD report of a company that has a tremendous track record in managing climate-related risks and still be none the wiser in terms of the impact that climate risk will have on that organization's long-term value prospects. So if it was, where do we need to drive for peak TCFD? My encouragement would be to develop that really deep understanding as to how climate risk will impact your ability to deliver your strategy and how climate risk will affect your ability to meet the needs of your stakeholders, whether that's customers, whether that's investors, whether that's regulators. So be clear on that and use scenarios to really be clear on how you do that. So let's just move on to the last slide with the resources that are available. I'd just like to highlight that to the audience today. Okay, so just in this slide deck, and I'm sure they're going to be highlighted, if you are on the journey to climate on climate-related disclosure, there are some key things to think about, both in these resources, but in these slides. But hopefully I've shared with you a snapshot of some of those priority areas. So if you want to learn more, please go to ey.com, put in climate risk barometer and have a look at the results. And it's presented in quite a user-friendly way that you can dig into what you want to dig in. And also on the website, there's some sort of really interesting publications. Particularly, we do an annual investor survey of about 300 investors, just understanding how they're using non-financial disclosure. And there's a big piece about how they're using the TCFD as a framework for looking at the performance companies. And we've also got the contact details, both for me, so I'll be happy to receive a call if you'd like to discuss any of these things through. Also my email address on here. And then two of my colleagues, Yuri Lee, who leads a lot of our work in the climate area, and Amy, who you'll be hearing from later. Anyway, thank you so much, Mardi, for inviting me, but I'm going to hand back to you.
Thanks, Doug. That was really great, and I always love it when Australia beats the UK at everything from reporting right through to cricket. So I'm always surprised to see that as well. But fabulous presentation, really has set the scene for where we're headed next. So I think it's time we jumped into the discussion, and get our panelists' take on, have we reached peak at TCFD? So I'm just going to quickly introduce them all briefly first, and then we'll go through them all one by one and get everyone to sort of give us their take, and then we'll move into some formal sort of question and answers. So I'm delighted to welcome Andrew Ratcliffe, who is the past president of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales. He's still a very active member of ICAW, chairing the Sustainability Committee, and as a member of the board of the ICAW Foundation. We're also joined by Martina Macpherson, who is the Senior Vice President of Strategic ESG Engagement and Partnerships at Moodys, and is also President of the Network for Sustainable Financial Markets, which is a fabulous network. So if you're not involved or don't know about it, look it up and get involved. Martina's put loads of energy into that, and it's brilliant. And she has a fabulous CV, including roles in ESG leadership at S&P and MSCI as well. Ed Douglas is the Sustainability Director at LandSec, and he's responsible for both the setting of the strategy and delivery of the strategy at LandSec, and has helped. And I mean, their reporting is absolutely fantastic, and it really put LandSec in a leadership position on sustainability issues, not just within the real estate sector, but more broadly across the UK and the world. So I'm really delighted to have Ed with us today. We're also joined by Rodney Owen, who I mentioned earlier is Managing Director of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development's Redefining Value in Educational Programs. He's a member of the WBCSD Senior Management Team, and he's responsible for overseeing projects designed to help companies measure and manage risk, gain competitive advantage, and seize new opportunities by understanding environmental, social, and governance information. And certainly not last, but definitely not least, is Amy Metcalf, who Doug introduced earlier, and she'll be joining to give the EY perspective, and she's the Director in Sustainable Business, previously at Share Action, so we can also throw some responsible investor questions Amy's way, if you have any. And she has, where she led programs for investors to engage with corporates around climate, business, human rights, food and nutrition, so maybe a bit post-TCFD picky there. But first, I'm going to hand to Andrew for your, if you can give us 90 seconds. Have we reached peak TCFD, Andrew?
Thanks, Mardi, and good morning, everybody. I mean, the short answer is, I agree with Doug, is no. If I think about the enterprise I'm involved with outside, this is outside ICAW, I think we did a better job in 2019 than in 2018, but with that recognition. We're certainly not there yet, and we've got a lot of plans to improve on that in 2020. But the other thing I'll just touch on, and I hope we sort of discuss this during the course of the morning, is I think it's important to think about the context we're in as we're coming out of lockdown and release in terms of social attitude. And there's been lots of comment about this, about how people want to engage with each other more, do things more locally, think about well-being and think about climate change. Who knows if that's sustained, right? I mean, we don't know. I mean, what is this sort of like post-Olympics euphoria or something? But it seems as if there's an opportunity there to engage consumer preference and view as well as investor preference and view. And I think certainly we're nowhere near peak on that.
Thank you, Andrew. Very interesting points, and I'm sure we'll pick up them straight after in the Q&A. I'm going to hand across to Martina now.
Sure. Maybe just to add what both previous speakers have said, ultimately we are not there yet. I just would like to highlight pieces of research by Moody's Investor Services from 2019 that have stated that companies' climate-related disclosures seldom actually reveal the potential financial impacts. That's something that Doug highlighted earlier on as well. And maybe to move from here and to address the question around peak, we haven't even mentioned yet the broader stakeholder impacts in the context of dual materiality and the calls that are currently out there by the EU non-financial disclosure directive. And hence, there is definitely a route and ways to go to improve. Maybe just to highlight a couple of key findings from that research, which actually also support the information that Doug earlier mentioned, and the research that's out there currently by E&Y. I mean, we looked at actually disclosures from 28 Moody's rated US and European entities in environmentally sensitive industries in 2018. These included similar sectors to what was highlighted: oil and gas integrated, oil and gas refining and marketing, utilities and building materials. And these companies have an outstanding combined debt of $877 billion by the end of 2018. Interesting to see that there are three main or key findings. Up and foremost, that climate-related disclosures are on the rise. They're reflecting a strong board and management attention. We have seen there are also conundrums around the strategic commitments, though. But ultimately, the quality and depth of reporting across these companies varies widely. And as a result, it is difficult to assess or compare potential climate-related financial impacts. And I hope we will dive a bit deeper into that question, either within a sector or even across different sectors. And there's a wide variation in what companies report, as well as the materiality thresholds they use to assess exposure to climate impact. And then lastly, disclosures seldom quantify the potential financial impact of climate change. Only 2 companies actually in our sample linked their climate expectations to future financial impacts. So the lack of the strategic components, and I would like to add the forward-looking perspectives. And as a last comment here, obviously walking the walk, from a Moody's Corporation standpoint, we have really significantly increased the level, the thresholds, the information within TCFD reporting that we put out there, and very happy later on, Mardi, to share a couple of examples how we are aiming to address all of the 11 TCFD recommendations, including quantitative scenario analyses and quantitative and qualitative scenarios analysis, for physical and then for transition risks.
Wow, fantastic. I look forward to talking a bit more about that. Ed, over to you.
Wow, how do I follow that up? I guess I'll keep it more from a LandSec perspective. We've committed to assess and mitigate climate change risks across our business since 2017. And then, ever since then, we've published our TCFD disclosure within our annual reports. I mean, putting that a bit more in context, I think probably not. I think no, we haven't reached the peak yet, and I say that as probably an organisation that's been an earlier adopter to TCFD, but also understanding that, you know, while our disclosures are, you know, the quality has evolved and improved, we still have a distance to travel. And as we move into a decade of action, a decade of change, I think we haven't quite hit it. So that would probably be my response.
Thanks, Ed. Rodney, have we reached peak TCFD?
Rodney, you're on mute.
Rodney, you're on mute.
There we go. So I'll start again. Of course, the answer is no, nowhere near it. There's a lot of noise in the system, and that noise is great, that people are talking about TCFD and talking about the potential of having financial disclosures related to the transition and physical risk associated with the climate emergency. But when it comes to you know, the practice of disclosure, and more importantly, that disclosure being acted upon by players in the capital market, I think we're a long way off reaching peak. There needs the gap that exists today needs to be addressed, and we need to start, like with all of these things, by looking inside the organisation. And I think what we have observed at the WBCSD is that there is appetite within organisations to address the challenges and opportunities presented by TCFD implementation. And we have been running for the last 2.5 years a thing called the TCFD Preparer Forum. And ironically, today is the launch date of our 5th report. Today, we've launched a report looking at construction and building materials at TCFD Preparer Forum. And alongside others in areas such as chemical sector, electric utilities, oil and gas, agri-food and forest sectors, we've brought together companies to talk about the opportunities and challenges associated with that. One of the biggest opportunities here is the collaborative cross-working inside the organisation of people, not only from sustainability function, but from the financial team, from risk management, from investor relations, etc. And we are seeing that the companies that are embracing the 4 recommendations, that they're on a journey that is producing some benefit. But we also hear that companies that have gone the extra mile and started to disclose against the TCFD recommendations, that the investor community just doesn't know what to do with them yet. So I think there's still a long way to go. And one of the things that it's always being debated is, well, if this is so important, which I'm sure everybody joining the call today would agree, it is important. The climate emergency is real and is becoming more accelerated. And the question that needs to be answered is, well, why is it still voluntary? Why is it still up to companies to decide whether or not they pursue this agenda? Why is it not something that is more regulated and therefore creates a level playing field that could create peak implementation? So at the WBCSD, we believe that the TCFD recommendations are vital, and many of the work efforts that we've had even predate the TCFD in risk management metrics and in governance. But I think we need to see this become something that companies have to do, not want to do, if we're going to ever get to your question of peak implementation.
I love the reframing into peak implementation, Rodney, in terms of action and really driving it forward. Amy, peak TCFD or not?
So it's always fun to go last, but no, I agree. We haven't reached peak TCFD. I think there's certainly some concerning trends highlighted by the EY Barometer and by the 2019 TCFD status report. Uptake seems to have stalled a bit in the last year. EY's research, although it was a much wider sample in 2019, showed that in 2018, 61% of companies were disclosing. 2019, only 54%. And as Doug said, the quality of responses are still not where they need to be to allow for investors to have decision useful information. However, there are hopeful signs as well, I think. We saw that the sectors that were most exposed to transition risk generally did a better job of addressing TCFD. We saw that the companies that were several years into their disclosure journey also had much better quality answers. So people are increasing in maturity. And we also see that there was a clear connection between investors' commitments on climate change and the TCFD performance of their portfolio companies. So those factors give me hope that the disclosures will continue to grow in coverage and in quality. I think ultimately, TCFD is the best tool that we have for disclosing climate impact. What we need is for the pressure to continue on companies to disclose, for that disclosure to include better scenario analysis and really start bringing out the financial impacts in a much better way than it is at the moment. That information needs to make the climate implications of climate risk clear for investors, and most importantly, it really needs to be used by the leadership of these organisations to help them embed climate considerations into strategic decisions. I think that's where we're at the moment.
All right, so slightly more optimistic, but we're definitely not there yet. So I think let's have some questions to our panelists, and I'll get the ball rolling. Please keep sending your questions in. We've got some great ones coming through, and we'll get to them after we do a first quick round with the panelists. But I'm keen to hear from you, Ed. You're our reporter on here. You're our company that's putting pen to paper and getting on with it. So you've done some really, really interesting work on physical risk with a London-specific scenario analysis. London-specific scenario analysis with Towers Willis Watson, for example. What was the driver to make that happen?
Yeah, good question. We assess the impact of our climate-related risks through some quantitative and qualitative scenario analysis, and considering a best case and a worst case scenario in the shorter and longer term. What was the driver? I think LandSec have, for the last 5 years or so, really been on an ambition to be a leader in sustainability. And I think the next iteration of that work and the opportunity to do this was to kind of assess and drive forward our work on climate resilience. This was the perfect opportunity to do it. So I think broadly, it was driven at the start through the sustainability team, but we've got really good governance in place, which has meant that we've been quickly able to drive that through chief executive and board. So I think that's the reason. I think that it just, we're able to demonstrate. We saw that opportunity to assess and advance our climate resilience work.
Great. Amy, are you seeing something similar from your clients, sort of a drive sort of up to the C-suite, or from the top down, what it looks sort of the sustainability team's just still chipping away from it in the silos, sort of, as Rodney said, have kind of been breaking down around some of their work around the preparer forums? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think we are seeing a shift. We've seen some clients having reorganizations, so moving their sustainability teams out of kind of comms and marketing and more into strategy, which I think is really positive. We're also seeing more and more matrix structures. So we're seeing certain teams taking certain elements of sustainability. For example, the chief risk officer looking after climate risk, the chief financial officer looking after TCFD disclosure, and the chief sustainability officer looking after sustainability strategy. So it's starting to be spread out in I think, a useful way. And yeah, I think there are still places where it's down in the weeds. And we recently did a review of disclosures in the FTSE 350 and where we could work out who was responsible for climate change. I think a lot of the times that's still a committee kind of deep down somewhere, but we are seeing more and more that being pulled up, and that committee actually is made up of board members or whatever else. So I think there is a shift, but it's a bit slow.
Very, very interesting. So Ed, we often hear from companies, and Rodney sort of alluded to this earlier, that investors are not asking for information on climate resilience, for example. Is this the case for you at LandSec?
I don't really think so. I mean, the first thing to say is that I think the investor community is becoming far more knowledgeable about climate, and that's certainly what we're seeing. We're quite proactive in our approach and engagement with our investor community. But I think the big questions that we're being asked are, what are those risks? But I guess the shift is, how are we also managing those risks? So for us, I guess, if we want the perfect question, it's we want to we've evolved our strategy to address climate-related risks, and I guess as part of that approach, when we're considering transition risks, last year we announced our commitment to become a net zero carbon business, and some of the examples that you draw out of that, and introducing an internal price of carbon in anticipation that might be the case in the short to medium term. Alongside that, we realigned our own science-based target in line with a 1.5 degree pathway. So it's what I think the big questions that are coming out are, what are those risks, but how are we managing those risks? I think it's the big takeaway. And but I would say that the questioning from our investor audience is becoming much more sophisticated, and they're much more knowledgeable and interested in this area.
That's good to hear. Sort of linked to that, Martina, we've seen a huge amount of work done on credit rating, by credit rating agencies on ESG issues in the past, over the last 18 months in particular. All the main players have pretty much acquired some sort of bespoke ESG related business and data provider to kind of help build the business out. And in your particular case, data is central to your ratings, rankings, tools, and analysis work that you do. We hear often that data quality and quantity is the biggest barrier to investors using that information for capital allocation. Do you think this is still true? And if so, what needs to be done to fix it?
It's a very good question. So yes, we obviously were one of the organizations that had major or has major stakes in two of the more renowned providers, data providers in the space, one Visio Iris for ESG assessments and opinions, and ultimately 427 for climate risk data and analyses. And up and foremost, it's fair to say that we have spent a lot of time now over the last 12 months around integration of information. You've probably seen we have done and undertaken joint efforts, especially with 427 up and foremost in this context of climate risk analyses, to create specific climate risk scorecards, etc. On the credit rating side. We have undertaken joint research. We have actually utilized 427's data, quantitative scenario analyses data for physical risk assessments, also for our own TCFD report that I highlighted a bit earlier, which was, by the way, selected this year by the TCFD Secretariat as a leading example case study for the new and upcoming report. But generally, and this is an observation that we all see in the market, there are inherent data biases and conundrums that remain. And these are up and foremost also linked to the levels and types of disclosures. They are linked to the sheer quantity of different type of standards and frameworks that are used for reporting. And hence, we are looking to this close alignment with key stakeholders in this space, such as CDSB and obviously SASB, TCFD, and others that we have also selected and actually endorsed in some of the consultations most recently that we have supported in order, to provide that level of harmonization and standardization that's required. And then ultimately there is still a confusion as well in understanding which types of data is actually relevant and material for which type of reporting. And is this information and data, even by the organizations, consistently displayed and reported across the different type of channels they use when we look at annual reports, integrated reports, sustainability reports, or other public filings, in order to collate that information and harmonize it at a data collection level. So I think there are multiple challenges here. I bring them down again to standardization of information, comparability and consistency of information, and again, very often then the challenge to make a call for the different type of pieces of information to be utilized to create a harmonized approach that also entails forward-looking perspectives, especially when we are looking in the climate risk context at the different time horizons and the scenarios that are needed and involved to actually assess that information.
Really, really valid points, and I take that. I understand very much. CDSB is about consistent, comparable material information, and the work never seems to be done there. We often hear, Martina, everyone talks about the challenges of TCFD. TCFD implementation is quite hard, but so let's think about a few positives. What were the opportunities you realised at Moody's as a result of using the TCFD recommendations?
Up and foremost, having guidance and a framework for physical and transition risks. This is, I think, a prerequisite to better understand why and how you need to report what type of information to assess financial impacts. And it is very important, given that we are also assessing the market on how and where these impacts, physical or transition risks, could make a landfall, which could lead to either economic or financial impacts, that we are also understanding when, how we can actually utilize this information to quantify our own risk assessments when it comes to climate risk exposures at a Moody's corporation level. And I think it was very important, or it is very important, to highlight and stretch that the debate has generally moved on, and this is also down, and thanks to TCFD, from a pure risk management and mitigation perspective to an opportunities management, adaptation and resilience building perspective. And the topics around operational resilience and how actually the framework can help to assess these opportunities is something that I think prior to TCFD was not very well understood generally in the industry. And that has helped us now in identifying, coming back to our report, the three different type of climate opportunities for Moody's that we wanted and obviously highlighted in the report, which link to strategic new products, research and development, and our broader focus and commitment towards memberships and associations and ultimately contributions, same as this one here, in the wider domain and space. And last but not least, clearly, the target setting and KPIs that are linked to the report have helped us really then to assess again the financial impacts that we have been challenging the industry on in our ongoing MIS research.
Thanks, Martina. I'm going to bring Andrew in now from the ICOW, because yesterday they signed up to the Green Finance Education Charter, which is absolutely brilliant. Everyone in the world should have these. The UK has led the way, I think, by putting this in place. And essentially what they've done is committed to integrating green skills into its professional qualifications. But it's one thing, Andrew, to educate our trainees as they're coming in and give them the skills. It's another altogether challenge to upskill your current membership who are already in the workforce, some of whom have maybe got 30 years left in the workplace. So for the profession to remain relevant and help, with the financial impacts that we've been hearing about earlier, addressing the financial impacts and really thinking those through, what are the three key steps and across what timescales do they need to happen or be implemented if we're going to get that peak TCFD?
Okay. Let's not pass over the issue of training new entrants too quickly, because easy to say, not say that we've been working on that for a number of years actually, in integrating it into the syllabus. And that's the key to this. It does need to be integrated. This is not a matter of, and I hope everybody on the panel would agree, this is not a matter of, we need a sustainability paper. Yeah, this needs to be part of everything else. And it's a pretty complicated and crowded syllabus already. So that's not being straightforward, but we're doing that, and that'll be starting to take place in exams soon. But yeah, let me give you the advertorial as to sort of what we're doing with our existing members. And I don't think it's 3 things we need to do, it's 150,000 things we need to do, because that's the number of members we've got. And you're right, they're all at different stages of their career, all with different stages of knowledge, all working in different contexts, different industries, different pieces of relevance. But what we've started to do, and this actually grew out of a conversation we had in the Sustainability Committee last year, when we posed ourselves the question of what does climate emergency mean for us as a professional institute? What we've started to do is take advantage of the fact that, you know, as a professional body, as many professional bodies do, we say to our members, look, you have an obligation to keep your skills and your competency up to date. And you need to continually examine your state of competency against the work that you're doing. You know, one of the sort of biggest things you can do wrong is set out on a piece of work you're not competent to do. So that is something we every member of the institute has to attest to every year, that they've thought about that, they've thought about the context in which they're working, and they've taken appropriate steps to repair their skills. We have, from the beginning of this year, told them that in doing that, they must specifically consider the effects of climate change. And you know, that's not just a sort of altruism, that's a fun thing to do, but we made that very pointed to say, look, you know, depending on the length of your career, certainly if it's going to be anything longer than 5 years, if you're not skilled on this, right, if you're not able to cope with this, you will not be fit for purpose for the clients you're advising or the companies you're working within. These are the sort of skills and the knowledge they're going to need. So, you know, that's kind of first step, is posing that, making people pose that question in their own minds. We're building up, I mean, there's a lot of material on our Sustainability Hub and our Climate Change Hub. We're adding to that almost daily, and we're adding to it with the L&E stuff as well. And clearly we're drawing on other pieces as well. So it's really just, I mean, what's the time scale? Well, you know, it's kind of, you want everything done yesterday, right? But encouraging, and, well, not just encouraging, I mean, pointing out to our members that this is now part of the obligation of membership. You need to get skilled in this.
Thanks, Andrew. Very, I like the part about integrating it into everything. That's not a bolt on at any one point.
Yeah.
So, thinking about the accounting profession in a different way, what do you think have been the biggest barriers preventing the profession from using existing IFRS accounting standards from being applied to climate-related information in mainstream filings?
Well, okay, I mean, probably, I mean, the main point here is, you know, IFRS is a model for financial reporting historically in the short term, and you might very justifiably say, well, that's kind of part of the problem, isn't it? And it is. But you know, that sort of financial reporting and that sort of accountability on companies, I think, is part of the reason why we've ended up in the mess we're in. So it is not a framework that is amenable to longer term consideration or forward-looking information, and not necessarily financially metriced information, and that's what we need to address climate change. So, I mean, having said that, if it's not, you know, it's not sort of okay, we just apply IFRS to climate change. Equally, I don't think you throw it all out. There are pieces of IFRS which are very much applicable. I mean, if you go to anything about financial instruments or impairment or valuation or provisioning, then you are essentially looking at a forward projection of cash flows in some manner or another, and a risk assessment across them, and so on and so forth. Well, you know, I don't need to say, kind of, that's the essence of what we're looking at here. So I think it's an issue of taking those skills. I mean, and you know, the whole trope about accountants are going to save the world is overused, I know, but it is very much the case that those core skills of looking at those future cash flows are there already, and looking at them with some rigor and with some criticism. That's what we need. But equally, we need to build up on the non-financial disclosures, and the recent IASB statement on that, I think, is useful. And we've actually recently done a publication as well on developing non-financial disclosures, particularly in the context of a sustainable global recovery, and that's on our website if people want to look at that.
Oh, they sound like really handy resources, Andrew, so we'll make them all publicly available, as well as all the resources everyone's mentioned on the call today. Rodney, resilience is one of the least used terms in TCFD reporting. So in your professional opinion, as a former internal controller for a multinational organization, is there a specific internal control environment required for TCFD reporting? And if so, do most organizations currently possess it, or is this something new? And I know you've got some great things at WBCSD to address this.
I mean, this is one of the frustrations I have with the sustainability community in general, is that there's been this push and desire to produce information that goes out into the public domain without really much thought and attention as to where this information comes from, how reliable it is, how assurable it is, whether or not it's fit for purpose. And I know this because in my previous role before the WBCSD, I worked as a group director of risk management, internal control, and as part of my job, I was made responsible for sustainability reporting, and was somewhat horrified as a chartered accountant to find that it was all done in spreadsheets and approximations and assumptions and all the rest of it. What we're talking about with TCFD is a disclosure that relates to financial positioning, and therefore it needs to be as free from material misstatement as any other financial disclosures, as far as I'm concerned. And the sustainability community needs to realise that that working with finance on this is actually a synergistic activity and not something to be frightened of. If your internal controls don't exist or are broken, then you cannot rely on any information that is being produced. And I feel that one of the barriers to the peak TCFD, as you referred to, is that much more time and effort needs to be placed internally to ensure that the information that is being used to drive internal decision making and used to disclose to an external audience is much more rigorous and than it currently is today. If we're serious about materiality, then we need to have data that is that can be accounted for. And I know Martina was talking about the importance of comparability and comparability, and that you can rely upon this. In the absence of a control environment, well, you can't. So I feel that TCFD, like many other of the reporting frameworks that are out there, have failed in some respect to emphasize the importance of solid and strong control environment on which to make disclosures. You mentioned the word resilience, and I think that leads to another issue that we observe here at the WBCSD, is that many companies don't do risk management. They do risk reporting. So when we see the growth in risk reporting coming from vehicles such as the EU Transparency Directive in 2008, 2009, many companies created a process to be able to comply with that particular piece of legislation. And when it comes to risk management, what I've seen and actually heard risk managers say, our job is to get the risks ready for disclosure as opposed to actually managing them. And one of the big failures in enterprise risk management, I think, today is that we still are obsessed with predicting the future. And if COVID-19 has taught us anything, is that we can't. Only 6 out of 150 companies that we did some desktop research on in April this year had any reference to a pandemic of this nature. When we look at the WEF report on risks that was published in January, a pandemic was mentioned in terms of impact, but was discounted as being unlikely to happen. But bear in mind, this is the 4th major respiratory illness in 18 years and the 2nd global pandemic in 11 years. So as human beings, we are not programmed to predict the future. We are obsessed, however, with believing we can. And that is the same issue when we look at risk management and in climate disclosure and climate risk management, is that we need to break away from our obsession with probability and look at our ability to manage recurring shocks that are much more frequent than we previously expected. this notion of climate change being a black swan or a pandemic being a once in a lifetime thing, well, it's actually happened in my lifetime and everybody else's lifetime in the last 11 years. It is not a black swan. If anything, it's probably a duck that looks a bit dirty. And there's a lot of them out there. And we need to realize that our job isn't to predict the future, but to manage it. And therefore, we need to see risk management evolve from asking the inane question of, is this likely to happen, to saying, if it did, could we manage it? Are we resilient? And if so, if not, well, how do we make that resilience within our organization real? So a long-winded way of saying that, we need internal controls. Finance needs to be heavily involved in TCFD disclosure practices. And when we look at the risk management, it does not surprise me that the Financial Stability Report's report last year showed risk management as one of the weakest areas of implementation. And I think it's weak because of our obsession with predicting the future. We need to get into assessing our own vulnerability to an uncertain future and to be honest about whether or not our business model and our flexibility, our ability to manage shocks is something that we can do.
Thanks, Rodney. And for anyone that hasn't had a look on the WBCSD website under Redefining Value pages, there's loads and loads of great resources there that Rodney has kind of indirectly kind of referred to there that can really help you think about your enterprise risk management, managing risk. Fantastic board games you can play internally to get some of these ideas going. Always really good fun. Rodney, just one last question for you. I'm sorry, we are running a little bit over, but the beauty of it being a live broadcast rather than a webinar is you can keep going, we can have some questions. So Rodney, you mentioned earlier the TCFD Preparer Forums, and you've been personally challenging me at CDSB to expand to cover social, so to go beyond environment to social, and your team have developed the Natural Capital Protocol. We know WBCSD are great for disruption. Should we be looking beyond climate with TCFD for all ESG issues and making it mandatory in mainstream filings by the end of 2021, in your opinion?
Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing in the TCFD that is not good business practice. I mean, it's about having good governance, it's about having scenarios, it's about having effective risk management, the important word there being management, and it's about metrics. There's nothing there that is revolutionary. What TCFD has brought to us is an institutional home like no other. So no disrespect to any of the reporting frameworks that exist today, but the fact that the TCFD was created and had a relationship with the Financial Stability Board and onward to the G20 finance ministers has given it an institutional home that makes it more credible than perhaps many of the other frameworks. But at the end of the day, what we need to address here is a balance between environmental, social, and governance, because we know that climate change, transition, and physical risks not only have issues in terms of the environment, but also on social. And what we've learned in the last few months is that a tiny, 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 tiny microscopic virus can bring companies to their knees. Many of those companies did not see that coming, and therefore are showing that perhaps risk management wasn't as effective as it could be. I always believe that we need to look at this holistically, and that we need to also make our accounting system future-proofed as well. It is in no one's interest that many of the big emitters become out of business, because our retirement assets in many cases are invested in them. We need an accounting system that allows companies to go into managed decline so that we can extract maximum value and not write off when we think something is impaired. So there's a lot that the system needs to rethink, because at the end of the day, this isn't about winners or losers, because all of humanity needs to be able to thrive as we transition to whatever the new normal is, whether that's the result of the pandemic or whether that's relating to what many believe will be a much bigger shock in the form of the climate emergency that we're facing. But if we haven't learned anything in the last 3 months, then I think that's a shame. The last 3 months has given us a taster of what the future has to hold. And the accounting profession, the investment community, the business community need to start talking to each other. They need to start coming up with solutions that create and preserve value, and that we work in partnership to create the society and the environment that we need.
Rodney, fantastic intervention as always. There is one question specifically directed at you on, and if we can do a brief answer, learnings from the TCFD Preparers Forum. Are you finding they're being picked up more broadly, or are they very much staying within those companies? And
well, you know, the Preparer Forum reports are publicly available, and you can go to wbcsd.org and download them very quickly. They're there designed to provide ideas and outcomes that the Preparer Forum members have identified, but we do know that other companies are reading them and are finding them very useful. So everything's free, a free resource. So go and look at it and take inspiration from the companies that have participated, but also try to look at the areas that have been identified as still problematic and become part of the solution, and not wait for somebody else to solve it for you.
Thanks, Rodney. We've had quite a few questions come in about regulation, who should enforce it, where's the teeth going to come in, how are we going to level the playing field? And I'm hoping maybe we can pick those up in our final sort of quick round, 1 minute each, sort of how are we going to, so anyway, let's start again. Loads of different questions on regulations that have come through and how we're going to enforce this, police this, make this happen, and at the pace that we need it to. Mark Carney, panelist, Mark Carney is tasked with, in his new role, with driving mandatory TCFD leading up to COP26 next November. And, you know, according to Doug's presentation and, you know, a lot of what I've heard from you all today, the UK is underperforming compared to other G20 nations. What one action would you take to make London and the UK the global leaders in TCFD adoption? And if you can touch on regulation, if that does feature in your thinking on the way through, that would be fantastic. Can I start with you, Ed?
I was hoping to go last, so I could have that. I was just extracting some notes. If someone could go before me, I can come back with my point.
Martina, could you step in?
Sure. I would just say what I highlighted earlier in the context of walking the walk, leading by example, and this is a tone from the top, literally, and obviously we need commitment from a policy and government perspective and clear, consistent messaging around material issues and how they actually will then be executed upon. And what I think is important, that we are not just always pointing the fingers at the corporations. There's more work to be done collectively to look beyond and across the wider investment value chain to actually address these issues. And it probably would help to then create the means alongside this collective spirit and the tools to provide comparability, consistency, quality of information, and how this is actually monitored. And if this is a question not really for the UK government, if this is a question more collectively for the investment value chain, how we can support the TCFD recommendations, then this is something we could hopefully bring up towards COP26 and make sure that this is actually a commitment then from a top-down perspective that we all can align with and towards too.
Andrew, how are we going to do this?
Yeah, what would Mark Carney do? We all need that T-shirt, right? You asked for one. I mean, I gave you 150,000 for three. I'm going to give you three for one, I think, this time. I mean, the first one is the easy one, but maybe the most important, which is just keep doing what you're doing, right? I mean, we've all said that this is getting better. And speaking from my other life of enterprises where we're preparing this stuff, the last thing you want is now, you know, a major change or a change in direction or whatever. This is bearing fruit. It is getting traction with investors. I think Larry Fink's letter in January, which I think Doug had on his slide one, I think that is going to be a real milestone, that they're saying this is going to affect the way we do investment allocation. So stick with it and keep pushing it. I think the investors I think is more powerful and more immediate than regulation, I have to say. I worry about a timescale of regulation, and I wonder about the complication and regulatory legal risk that brings in, but I'll leave others to comment on that. The second thing I would say, and I absolutely agree with Rodney, this does need to be broadened. This does need to encompass social and biodiversity. We've not spoken about those, but they're absolutely got to be on the agenda here. And then the third one, I mean, really back to where I started, I think that the big opportunity now is to find a way, I mean, and maybe it's through TCFD, of just as that is engaging and affecting investor preference and investor action, can we engage consumer preference? Can we change the way that people buy and where they spend their money with companies? Because I think that is an even more powerful and an even quicker lever on what a company does than their investors. If we can give consumers really sensible, robust information about the carbon footprint of their spending and which companies can help them reduce that carbon footprint, I think that will be a huge step forward.
Thanks, Andrew. Amy.
So I think I'd echo what Andrew said, which is there's a lot about just keeping going here. I think in our barometer, we saw that the UK firms were doing quite well in governance, but there was lots of work to do in strategy, metrics and targets. So at least we know it's starting to be on the radar of leadership. I think the really important thing is to set bold ambitions and make them quantifiable, as we've all talked about that being really lacking at the moment. And the recent wave of net zero ambitions is really great to see, but we need companies to be able to demonstrate a clear understanding of what that means for their business and understand that in the short, medium and long term. And I think if we can get to that, and that moves the dial quite quickly.
Thanks, Amy. Rodney, what would Mark Carney do?
Well, Mark Carney's already indicated in the 12th of October last year at the TCFD summit in Tokyo that he expects to see this regulated within the next 2 years, and I therefore hope that that is what happens. I agree with Andrew and others that it would be great if consumerism or, the moral compass that executives suddenly develop overnight drives us in the right direction. I fear that the speed with which we need to act will not be fast enough if we rely on this being something that we hope people will do. I think the climate emergency is such an issue that politicians need to really do what they should be doing, which is focusing on the next generation and not on the next election, and that they put in place appropriate measures to require companies to acknowledge they have an impact and dependency on the climate and other ESG considerations, and that is transparent in its external disclosure. And I would also go as far as to say the accounting profession, and particularly the role of the statutory auditor, evolves to ensure that the concept of going concern includes whether or not the company is taking this agenda seriously, and whether or not they see that somewhere in the future there is a potential crisis through inaction to address both the climate emergency and other ESG considerations.
I do hope Mark and his team are listening again, because there's some really good insights coming out of this group today, and the chat and the website is really reflecting that. Now, last but absolutely definitely not least, Ed, it's your turn.
Well, I was just going to wrap it up by saying all of the above. I totally in agreement. No, big takeaway for me is looking at the social side of that, but really interested to hear what Andrew and Rodney made around the kind of consumerism and how we can potentially change attitudes and behaviours. So I think I'll leave it on that note.
Well, thank you all, and thank you for indulging me with an extra 15 minutes. I don't think it was worth stopping. Brilliant questions and answers from all of you, and fantastic presentation from Doug at the beginning. So thank you all for joining me today. Doug, Andrew, Martina, Ed, Rodney and Amy. And thank you to my team in the TCFD CDSB Secretariat for making this event happen. really, you can't do it without the back end making these things real. And it's clear we're not at peak TCFD yet, but there are some movement in the right direction. And those mandatory signals, I think, will really help push us in that direction and beyond. So thank you again for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of London Climate Action Week activities. There really are some truly fantastic events scheduled. And I look forward to welcoming you to another CDSB webinar in the future. So thank you, everyone.